Hello everyone, in this video I'll walk you through the assembly of your Cybersled X1. You can easily print and assemble it yourself, even on a standard 256mm build volume. A complete list of required hardware is provided in the description below, or on my website. With that being said, let's dive into the build. To begin assembling the track, you'll need 30 links. Use 3mm PACF filament as pins, cutting the filament flush on both sides as you install it. After assembling all 30 links, melt the tab on both sides of each link to secure the pins in place. Leave one link free for later sled installation. Now, let's prepare the front chassis. Begin by test fitting the tie rod, ensuring smooth, unhindered movement. Before continuing, install two structural M3x10mm screws into the bottom of the steering rack. Next, orient the steering rack as shown, with the slant directed toward the lettering on the chassis. Install the rack onto the tie rod with two M3x10mm screws. The servo installation is straightforward. Double check that it's centered at its neutral point before installing. Route the servo wire underneath the tie rod as shown, before pushing the servo into place. Now, attach the servo horn so it sits between the steering rack columns. Then, secure the servo with M4 screws. Position the support bracket as shown, making sure the lettering is up against the motor wires. Then, drive in a structural M3x10mm screw in the backside of the motor mount. Now, attach the motor mount to the frame using 4 M3x20mm screws. Then, install the motor, making sure the wires point upwards. Lastly, secure the support bracket with two M3x10mm screws. For the drive shaft, cut an 8mm rod to a length of 150mm. Ensure a free sliding fit for the bearings. Light sanding may be required if the rod is oversized. Place the drive shaft into the drilling fixture, ensuring it's flush on both sides. Then, lock it down with M3 screws. Utilizing a 1/8 inch drill bit, bore the 3 indicated holes in the rod. A drill press is highly recommended for steel drive shafts. After drilling, remove any burrs or debris from the driveshaft holes. Now for the drivetrain, the most challenging part of the build. Begin by inserting two M3 nuts into the channel on the backside of the printed pulley. Align one nut with the side hole and secure it with a grub screw, engaging both the plastic and the nut. This setup allows the pulley to mount securely to the motor shaft thanks to the flat surface, and additionally provides durable metal threads for the grub screw. Prepare the driveshaft mount by pressing an 8mm bearing flush into each side of the mount. Next, determine the correct placement of the driveshaft mounts to accommodate your belt length. Install the driveshaft, pulleys, and belt. Remove the belt slack by pulling the driveshaft back until the belt is taut but still removable. Note the driveshaft mount positions relative to the frame. Then, remove the belt and pulleys. Secure the mounts in the desired position with M3 by 8mm screws, ensuring that they don't poke through the tunnel. Mount it at the same position on the other side. Position the drive cog in the tunnel, aligning its central hole with the bearings in the mounts. Then, install the drive shaft, inserting the end with the two holes first to engage with the drive cog. Align the two holes and fasten the cog with two M3 by 20mm screws. Coordinate the large pulley onto the drive shaft and secure it with an M3 by 20mm screw. Reattach the small pulley and the belt. We'll then proceed to the next step. It is recommended to use a small amount of thread locker on the grub screw when securing the small pulley. To prepare the belt tensioner assembly, press fit two M3 bearings into the tension pulley and an M8 bearing into the motor shaft bracket. Lastly, fasten the pulley to the arm with two M3 by 10mm screws. To create an anchor point for the tension arm, thread an M3 by 150mm rod into the dedicated hole on the side of the tunnel. Then, press fit the tension arm onto the rod, following the arrow's direction. Complete the drivetrain by attaching the motor shaft support bracket with two M3 by 10mm screws, aligning the small hole with the threaded rod and the bearing with the printed pulley. Give your drivetrain a test spin. You've conquered the most challenging part of the build. Let's move on to the next step. First, fasten the front chassis piece with 6 M3 by 8mm screws. Then, join the 2 remaining large assemblies with 8 M3 by 20mm screws. Lastly, attach the final chassis piece with 8 M3 by 20mm screws. Route the motor and servo wires into the electronics chamber. Begin the body assembly by fastening the 2 side panels to the middle section using 6 M3 by 8mm screws. Align the body panel assembly with the chassis and secure it with 2 M3 by 10mm screws on each side. Now, flip over the assembly and drive in 4 M3 by 20mm screws as demonstrated. Flat-headed screws are strongly recommended for this step. Any screw heads protruding inside the tunnel will cause track problems down the road. Align the seat body panel with the corresponding holes on the bottom of the tunnel before securing it with 4 M3 by 20mm screws. Carefully join the 2 main tunnel pieces, then fasten them with 3 short M3 by 6mm screws on each side. Leave the 4th hole open for now as shown. Lastly, attach the tunnel brace with 8 M3 by 6mm screws. Carefully combine the chassis assembly to the tunnel as shown, then secure it with 6 M3 by 6mm screws. Additionally, fasten 4 M3 by 20mm screws from the inside of the tunnel. First, install the top hood cover with the use of 3 8mm length screws. Then, join the assembly to the main hood piece with 2 M3 by 10mm screws. Additionally, fasten a longer M3 by 20mm screw towards the front. And to finish off this step, snap the two TPU hood fasteners into place. Start by fitting the pad into the TPU handlebar. Then, fix the throttle and brake levers with a hint of superglue. If you're opting to install a voltage display, do so now with two M3x6mm screws. Otherwise, install the dash cover. To complete this section, please fit the handlebars into the designated hole in the dash. Then, secure it with an M3x10mm screw. Assemble the seat with 6 M3x10mm screws. You may need to sand down these tabs on each side for a proper fit with the body. Let's start assembling the skid. First, cut an M3 rod to a length of 75mm. Thread it through the tension axle and secure it on the back with a lock nut, as shown. On the front, use a regular M3 nut to clamp the rod firmly in place. It's crucial that this rod doesn't spin, otherwise, the track tensioner won't function correctly. To be extra safe, I'm putting a drop of thread locker on both nuts. Next, insert two M3 nuts into each side of the tension knob. Then, insert two M3 bearings into both rear tension cogs. Assemble the track tensioner by threading the axle into the knob, as shown. Next, attach the tensioner assembly to one of the rear halves of the main skid using 4 M3x20mm screws. Spin the knob and test out your tensioner. Now, install an M3x20mm screw in the location shown. This will be the resting point for the rear link. Repeat on the other side. Then, using the rear link to ensure proper alignment, join the two halves of the skid together. Secure the second half with 4 M3x20mm screws. Lastly, press fit or thread 4 M3x150mm structural rods into the ends of the skid halves. Next, attach one of the front skid halves to the central skid piece using 4 M3x20mm screws. Due to design improvements, your version might only require 3 screws per side. Additionally, fasten an M3x20mm screw for the front link to rest on. Furthermore, use an M3x25mm screw to attach the rear strut to the link. A shock length of 130mm to 140mm is recommended. Next, install an M3x20mm screw in the corresponding location on the other front skid half. Use this screw to align the half with the main assembly. Then, secure it in the same way as the other side. Temporarily secure the link and shock by sliding an M4 rod through both of them. Next, cut an M3 rod to roughly the width of the skid. Use this rod and the designated shock mounting points to fasten everything together. If you're using a longer shock like mine, use the hole shown. For shorter 110mm or 120mm shocks, consider a mounting hole closer to the front. You can always adjust this later. Attach the upper link to the rear shock with an M3x25mm screw. Next, press fit two M8 bearings into each guide wheel. Slide the wheels onto the upper link, one on each side, and then add a guide wheel spacer to each side to complete the assembly. Before combining both track skid modules, you may tack on both rear tension cogs with two M3x25mm screws. Fasten the screws as tight as they will go without interrupting the wheel's ability to freely spin. Finish off this step by carefully aligning all the structural rods as you bring the two skid modules together. Once completed, secure the rear half of the skid to the central skid piece with 6 M3x20mm screws. Lastly, combine both rear links with the use of an M3x25mm screw and a lock nut. Install the rear fender with a few M3x8mm screws. Then, glue the taillight lens into place. For those installing taillights, carefully loosen one side of the tunnel brace. This will allow you to neatly route the taillight wires underneath the brace and into their designated slot on the bottom. Once the wires are in place, retighten the tunnel brace. Route the taillight wires forward into the battery compartment and then to the electronics chamber. Neatly press the two LEDs into the rear fender. Finally, glue two wire covers to the tunnel, positioned as shown. To assemble the bumper, begin by securing a mount to each side. Use M3x6mm screws in the first 3 holes per mount, for a total of 6. Next, install the main bumper piece and fasten it in place with 6 M3x10mm screws. First, cut an M4 rod to a length that's roughly the width of the tunnel, with 10mm extra on each side. Carefully slide the rod through the tunnel, the link, and the front shock. secure it in place with a lock nut on each end. Carefully thread an M3 by 130mm rod through the tunnel and rear link assembly. Install an axle cover on the side opposite the belt with two M3 by 8mm screws. Join the two guard pieces and install the corresponding rail with a total of 4 M3 by 10mm screws. Then, repeat the process for the opposite side. Looking at the underside of the sled, attach the guard assemblies with one M3 by 20mm screw in the front and an M3 by 6mm screw towards the rear. Next, secure the rails to the tunnel with 6 M3 by 8mm screws. Add an M3 by 10mm screw to the remaining hole towards the rear of the sled. Begin by press fitting 2 brass bushings into each knuckle. Additionally, insert a lock nut into the location shown. Next, install 2 brass bushings into a control arm. Then fasten an M3 tie rod end onto the control arm with a long M3 by 25mm screw. Repeat the same process for all 4 control arms. Attach the left upper control arm to the left impact plate with an M3 by 20mm screw on each side. Gently tighten the screws until they barely touch the brass bushings. Then, mount the lower left control arm using 2 M3 by 25mm screws. Cut 2 M3 rods to 85mm each. Thread one rod partway into the knuckle, stopping just before the lower tie rod end mounting point. Align the lower tie rod end and thread the rod through, leaving just 20mm protruding above the knuckle. Lastly, install the upper tie rod end into place and lightly secure it with an M4 lock nut. Repeat for the other side. Fasten both front struts into place with M3 by 20mm screws. A shock length of 130mm is highly recommended. Note the alignment features on both the chassis and impact plate. Angle the impact plate to insert its tab into the chassis slot, aligning the tie rod hole. Further adjustment may be needed before the plate snaps into place. Secure it with 2 M3 by 20mm screws. Avoid using excessive force when attaching these plates. Experiment with different angles and gently wiggle the plate back and forth until you find the correct approach. Steering links. each measuring approximately 102 millimeters eye to eye. You'll need an M3 rod and 4 tie rod ends. Add 2 spacer nuts to an M3 by 20 millimeter screw. Then, use it to fasten the steering linkage to the tie rod. Repeat on both sides. Before flipping the sled right side up, install the skis in their TPU springs with 2 M3 by 25 millimeter screws. If the skis don't rotate freely, loosen the screws until they do. Lastly, upright the sled and finish installing the steering linkages with 2 M3 by 20 millimeter screws. Feed the track onto the drive cog from the front. Depending on your driveshaft adjustment, you may need to add or remove a link for proper track fitment. Use a final filament pin to close the loop. The ideal track tension is as tight as possible without hindering free rotation. Avoid any binding, but also eliminate slack to prevent the track from hitting the tunnel. Too much slack risks the tunnel contact, while excessive tension leads to premature wear and increased motor strain. Install both ski handles with 2 M3 by 8 millimeter screws. My focus is on mounting and routing everything neatly. Ensure your battery and motor wires reach the ESC, and avoid anything protruding upwards that would interfere with the hood. Test fit the dash and hood to confirm proper clearance. Crucially, as soon as you turn on your radio, set your steering servo's range of motion to 20 to 30 degrees in each direction. If the servo is allowed to angle beyond the limit of the steering mechanism, you'll end up replacing a lot of tie rod parts. Power up the track and ensure everything spins freely. Adjust track tension as necessary. The final steps include press fitting 4 to 6 LEDs into the designated holes in the hood, mounting the seat tab using 2 M3 by 10 millimeter screws, and installing the TPU fasteners on the side compartment covers before latching them closed. That wraps up the Cybersled X1 build. Join the Cybersled community on Facebook or Discord. The design's already seen tons of improvements thanks to our awesome small community. Or feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm always happy to help. And remember, every day is a good day to send it.